All right, folks, so I am on my porch for this lecture. I figured it might be a good time to have an outdoor lecture considering the subject matter today, which is Al-Farabi. Um, I want you to hear nature sounds. I want you to have the vibe of nature. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the lecture in my backyard because the light was too bright and everything would be blinding. But here on my front porch, you should be able to hear certain nature sounds, including cars. There's a nice little sound that nature provides for us, right? Gets at the question of what is nature and what is not nature. But Al-Farabi, so why did I say that it would be good to be outside when we talk about Al-Farabi? Well, like many of these early philosophers that we've discussed so far, he was thinking a lot about the question of how nature works. So when Al-Farabi looked at the natural world, he saw something somewhat akin to the Neoplatonist that we've been talking about, and his view is broadly Neoplatonist. But what's interesting and what sets him apart from other authors is that he brought, maybe other authors since Plato, exception might be Plato, he brought his view of the cosmos down into the ordinary life of ordinary people. And the question of politics, the question of ethics, he thought that all those were shot through with questions that had to do with the ultimate nature of ultimate things. So it all begins with the one and the emanations from the one. He has a series of levels of emanations. Remember, when we have an emanation happening, it's not an intentional act of creation. There's God here, but God just sort of unconsciously creates everything else that comes from it. So from God or the one. So there's no conscious decision or design here. It's just that everything there's a succession of ones, and Farabi sees these as the succession of levels of heaven. And by heaven, we just mean the sky, right? So we have levels of stars, and the spheres all the way till we get to the sun and the moon is the lowest sphere. It's the closest sphere to us, and it is the sphere that's most imperfect, because the perfection sort of decreases as they go. And then associated with that level of the moon is what's called the active intellect. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let me first, we'll stop there at the active intellect, go back, talk briefly about Al-Farabi biographically, and then come back. So his dates were 870 to 950 AD. He spent a lot of his life in Baghdad. This would be what we call after the Golden Age of Baghdad. But just at the tail end of the Golden Age, essentially, the Islamic Golden Age. He probably was Persian or Turkish in heritage, almost certainly not Arab heritage. That is the Arab sort of ethnicity. But he had influence in the Arab-speaking world, the world that was dominated by Islam, but also in Baghdad we still have a lot of pluralism. We have a lot of Christians, we have a lot of Jews, a lot of cultures combining, a lot of trade, and in fact this becomes sort of central to thinking about how Farabi saw politics. So let's get back to this active intellect. So the active intellect is the connection that becomes possible between human beings living our ordinary lives here in the ordinary world with birds tweeting and, I don't know, like presidents, politicians tweeting as well, different kind of tweeting. But, the ordinary world, it's the connection between the ordinary world and the heavens, the one. So how does that connection work? We have a lovely little, I don't know, does that vehicle even have a muffler? It's exciting to give lectures outside. So we have this succession of heavenly objects, of the descendants of the one, the emanation spit off from the one. We have the succession of heavenly objects becoming gradually more distant from it, but still individualized. But eventually we get so distant from the one that we have multiplicity enter in. And multiplicity enters in here, right? The active intellect is one of the last places where we lack multiplicity, where we have the singularity. And the active intellect provides understanding of the truth to those who are capable of understanding the truth, capable of receiving the truth among human beings. Human beings are separated from animals and from plants and from inanimate objects because of our capacity primarily to have some sort of direct or indirect connection to the active intellect through the process of will. So we are willing beings. We are capable of making willing decisions. We are capable of understanding good and bad and choosing. Freedom is a very big thing that Farabi emphasizes in this process, both for religious reasons and for philosophical reasons. So there's the active intellect. For us here on Earth, we have in our own possession, the passive intellect. The appropriate passive intellect's role is to receive the impressions of the active intellect and to, as it were, be transformed by them. You may be interested to know from a religious standpoint that at times Farabi and others influenced by him portray the active intellect as the Holy Spirit, right? Don't get things mixed up here. The Holy Spirit in Islam is not the third person of the Trinity, right? There is no Trinity. One of the key facets of the Islamic faith is that God is one, and they take Christians to be heretics in ascribing multiplicity to God, and they think the notion of the Trinity is complete nonsense. Nevertheless, the Holy Spirit is a scriptural reality in scriptures that they respect and consider inspired. So they talk about the Holy Spirit as this lesser thing, right? This lesser thing, we have the one up here, we have the active intellect, the Holy Spirit, potentially down here or midway, and we have human beings and animals down there. Okay. The Holy Spirit is best received, or the active intellect is best received by those with tremendous insight. And Farabi particularly has in mind the Prophet Muhammad here. Maybe has in mind individuals like the Prophet Moses, maybe has Jesus in mind. Remember, Jesus is just a prophet, one of the central prophets for Islam. But these individuals can have a passive intellect which is appropriately situated, and they're intellectually in such a place and spiritually in such a place that they can receive from the active intellect the truth. So they have a particular special understanding of the truth. And what is this wisdom that they have? How does that play out? Well, they have insight into, from a political or ethical standpoint, this is the central thing. They have insight into what happiness is. and what types of activities are associated with happiness, both for individuals and for societies. And so this is how we get politics linking with metaphysics and ultimate reality for Farabi. Because when you know what happiness is and what things will lead to happiness, that's what living is all about on this view, right? That's what living is all about. So you can teach others and you can follow for yourself the types of activities, the types of engagement, the types of thinking that are associated with being happy. And you can, for others, create structures, even if you have political power, create structures of the state. And here we have an echo of Plato's Republic, but create structures within the state that will most appropriately lead people to whatever understanding they're capable of and happiness. So we said that for Farabi, human activity, what distinguishes human beings is the will. So it's very critical to Farabi that societies are not constructed to overpower people, to push the truth and goodness down their throats, but rather to transform their souls, to transform them into virtuous individuals that can then freely choose, because this free choice is going to be partially constitutive of the happiness that arises from it. That is not to say that this is a laissez-faire society. Very far from a laissez-faire society. Instead, we have very intense, powerful educational an educational setup established, though he doesn't talk a lot about the nature of this educational scheme. And he's a big respecter of Plato, so maybe we can fill in some of those gaps with the way that Plato talked about education. But we have an educational setup that would, and maybe a religious setup, maybe this is religious education, and maybe we can see this in the history of Islam, but a religious setup that would teach people how to live so that their free will from their understanding, their education, would conform to the activities that would lead to happiness. Though they do not have a passive intellect. He's an elitist in this way. They don't have a passive intellect that could get them there straight from the reception of the active intellect, but they can get it second, third, fourth hand from a succession of teachers that he calls rulers at different levels. There's different levels of rulers, and these rulers would guide someone toward what is true happiness, both for the individual and the society. So that's the big picture from the metaphysics down to the politics. Now, since I'm writing a paper on it right now, I'm going to talk briefly about his vision of democracy, because Farabi talks about democracy, or what he calls democracy. I don't think it really qualifies as what we would call democracy, but he has some interesting things to say. So he lived in Baghdad. Baghdad was a place that was very broad set of different people. It was very cosmopolitan. It also had a political history of rulers getting deposed, kicked out, replaced by other dynastic rulers, either within the same dynasty or from other dynasties. This is all within the Islamic tradition, within the caliphates. Caliph is a successor to Muhammad that has political and religious authority. So they lose some of that religious authority by the time Farabi comes along. There's been lots of instability politically. So what often happens is that the people get dissatisfied and they sort of replace their ruler. That seems to be somewhat close to what Farabi thinks of a democracy as. It's a rule of the people. But he doesn't talk about voting. Okay, he doesn't envision it as, much less voting in the leaders through a specific, legal voting process. He doesn't talk about that at all. Instead, it's sort of like successions of potentially mob rule, or not really mob rule, but a mob veto. right? We have leaders, but when they're not working out for us, we replace them, right? This isn't procedural democracy at all. But he does envision what he calls democracy as a very liberal society, by which he means that it's a society focused. He has a set of different ignorant cities, one of which focuses on honor, one of which focuses on sheer power, one of which focuses on just providing people's needs. The democracy for him focuses on freedom, so that every action of the leaders is focused, if they're going to be good leaders, not actually good, but good for the democracy. Every action of the leaders is focused on maximizing freedom for the greatest number of people. So we can think of this as sort of anticipating the, what is sometimes called classical liberalism, type of liberalism that you see in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century, in some ways less in the early 21st century, but that there would be as much freedom for as many people as possible in the state. And these freedoms conflict. Farabi anticipated that. He said that when the freedoms conflict, the goal would be to maximize as much freedom in the society as possible, and that would mean that the leaders would have to take away some people's freedoms to allow other people to have the greatest scheme of freedoms possible, with everyone having that scheme. My paper is about this, anticipating Rawls, if you've heard anything about John Rawls. So it's interesting that we see that picture of freedom in Farabi. It's also interesting that we see it critiqued as not being what he thinks of as the best. He does think that democracy is either the second or third best kind of state. The timocracy, focused on honor, he says, has sort of formally, it looks more like the ideal state. But interestingly, if the focus, if what's being appreciated is honor, the philosophers in a timocratic city will potentially experience some form of oppression. In a democratic city, they will not experience oppression, or not nearly as much, because everyone's free to do what they like. And so he says the democratic city will include as much of the good as any of the ignorant cities, more of the good than any of the other of the ignorant cities, and more of the bad too than any other of the ignorant cities, because there's just everything, we just let everything in. It's all in there. And maybe you look at America compared to other states around the world right now, you might sympathize with this. You might say, yes, there's more good here and there's more bad here. There's just more here. You might not sympathize with that, because you may think that oppressive sort of societies dominated, or societies focused on domination, or tyrannical societies, have a lot more bad than we have. The other side of that, one might say, is if the leadership has goals that are all good, they can affect those through the tyranny. Living in a liberal society, I don't think that argument quite works for me. However, Farabi, some interpreters think that Farabi actually thinks that we should be in democracies, because they claim that he thinks that the perfect society that he envisions is not actually possible on Earth. But I think the religious setting of his text suggests that it is possible, in his view. And he wants it to happen. But it's very difficult to establish, because what we were talking earlier, it involves this unbroken connection between the metaphysical truth, between the one, between God, the system of emanations, the active intellect, linking up with the passive intellect of some leader, and being enacted in the actual workings of the state. So these are my thoughts about Farabi. I'm very excited about the guy right now. Happy to answer questions or talk with you about him. There's tons of stuff that I haven't read of his. There's also tons of stuff of his that isn't translated into English. So yeah, I'm trying to learn Arabic. You can come, learn Arabic with me, and we'll figure that stuff out. Cool. Anyway, see you next time.